In 1939, when the armies of Great Britain and the Empire found themselves at war for the second time in a generation, they were armed with the venerable SMLE, by then officially known as the Rifle No. 1.
Well, you're right about that, I suppose. If the SMLE was good enough for Dad, it was good enough for us. But that first part of the war didn't go too well now, did it? The Phony War, the fall of France, Dunkirk, St. Valery. And I bet you're wondering why things went the way they did. And, more importantly, what could have made it better? Well, I'll tell you. Things would have gone our way if everybody had their pockets done up! Gah! Never seen anything like it in all my life!
This was due to economic reasons over anything else. Great Britain had been crippled economically by the Great War, and with the realities of policing the empire, a new rifle had not yet entered production in any meaningful way by the time Poland was invaded. Now, there had been some work done in the intervening years, but only by design, experiments, and a very limited series of trials. The design was there, but it would take until 1943 for the design to be finalized, produced, issued, and used to any great extent during operations. This new rifle would single-handedly write the next chapter in the service history of the Lee-Metford and Lee-Enfield rifles. This, of course, was the Rifle No. 4. When the FN self-loading rifle was adopted by most Commonwealth armies in the 1950s, the rifle it replaced had been in service in various patterns and marks since the early 1890s. The No. 4 Lee-Enfield had entered service during the crucible of the Second World War, and it represented perhaps the most evolutionary step in the progression of the series since the adoption of the SMLE in the immediate aftermath of the Boer War. The No. 4 wasn't used to any great extent until 1943, with a very limited amount finding their way to North Africa for the Tunisian campaign, and many more being issued for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. It would end up serving in all theaters, from Normandy to the Rhine, from Burma to Alaska, and from Italy to Holland. Post-war, it served all over the globe, in Korea, and all the campaigns of the early 1950s, and was still serving in frontline service as a rechambered sniper rifle in 1982 during the Falklands War. As this video is being made, it is only just being replaced in service with the Canadian Rangers, a paramilitary force responsible for augmenting the rest of the Canadian military with local knowledge, bushcraft, survival skills, and guiding expertise, predominantly in the Canadian North. Whereas the SMLE was the iconic rifle of the Great War in British and Empire service, the same could be argued for the No. 4 in the Second World War, despite the fact that it was only used for the latter half. It was truly one of the great military rifles of the 20th century. Although a separate rifle in its own right, it represented the last general service variant of a family of rifles, and its background and development bears mention. The British and Empire armies finished the Great War armed with the ubiquitous SMLE. While economies prevented the wholesale pursuit of a new service rifle, there were some changes and experiments made towards bettering the service rifle. It is important to realize moving forward that none of these interwar variants were actually issued for anything more than trials, if at all. The SMLE remained the service rifle as it had been, right up to the midpoint of the Second World War. Provisionally known as the Mark V SMLE, this version did away with the tangent backside of the Mark III and replaced it with a sliding aperture ladder at the rear of the body. This had actually been recommended before the Great War, but wartime economies had made that an unrealistic goal. It would seem that this rifle was intended for troop trials, but there were some 20,000 produced, a fairly large number for such a purpose. It is also interesting that it has no list of changes entry, and seemingly the separate Mark V designation is somewhat unofficial. The second step towards a new rifle was taken in 1926 and didn't involve the design at all, but rather the name. In that year, Army nomenclature changed, turning what was the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III into the rifle No. 1 Mark III. The rifle No. 2 being a .22 training rifle, and the No. 3 rifle, the P14. In 1926, the first of 3 runs of experimental rifles were produced, which marked a departure from the characteristic shape of the SMLE. This was the rifle No. 1 Mark VI, and it was in these rifles that the salient characteristics of what would eventually become the No. 4 became visible. The one-piece charger bridge and body, a new style of nose cap allowing the barrel to protrude about 2 inches was introduced, and interestingly, there was checkering on the forestock. In 1931, the No. 1 Mark VI was given other minor changes and a new name, the No. 4 Mark I, the first run being produced for troop trials only. Finally, in 1939, the design was finalized, and the No. 4 Mark I entered its service life. Production began somewhat later, however, in 1941. In fact, as mentioned before, any meaningful use of the No. 4 would wait until 1943. The design incorporated a large number of key improvements over the SMLE and was very much a new design of rifle, albeit one of the same family and lineage. It was certainly not just a modified No. 1. The vast majority of the changes made were done to ease manufacture, which would figure prominently in the wartime economy. The heart of these changes lay in the receiver, or body, and the barrel. Whereas the body of the SMLE had essentially been that of the preceding magazine Lee-Enfield, with a charger bridge added, that of the No. 4 underwent a complete redesign. The charger bridge was made integral to the machining, and provision was made for the mounting of a new style ladder sight, its angular shape betraying the economies in manufacture previously referenced. The barrel was made heavier, obviating the necessity of the complicated bedding with springs and tension as found in the SMLE. This gave better, more stable harmonics and made for better accuracy. It was produced with 5-groove Enfield rifling, although as a matter of wartime economy, 2-groove rifling was adopted with minimal effect on accuracy. It was relieved for nearly its complete length, with only a short 2-inch section in contact with the muzzle, interestingly with an intended 5-pound upward pressure. Other, perhaps more cosmetic changes were as follows. The nose cap of the SMLE was abandoned and a new style was adopted which left the barrel exposed for about 2 inches, giving rise to the No. 4's most distinctive feature. This also facilitated the fixing of a new style bayonet directly to the barrel. More on that later. The woodwork underwent substantial revision. The butt was left wider, which gave the wrist a distinctive thick feel as compared to the SMLE, and the butt plate was made of steel. The handguard was in 2 pieces, resting atop the forestock, retained by bands at the midpoint and the muzzle. The working of the bolt, safety, and magazine were not changed from the SMLE. Small details, however, were, and it remains that neither are interchangeable with the previous rifle. The bolt release was a spring-loaded catch located just behind the charger bridge. After withdrawing the bolt to that position, depressing the catch allowed the bolt head to be rotated and the bolt to be removed from the body. The bolt was replaced by simply pushing the bolt head down onto the spring catch and then forcing it home. From 1941, the No. 4 Mark I Star was introduced. Primarily, This entailed the making of some alterations to the method of removing the bolt. Instead of a catch, there was a simple slot cut in the guideway, allowing the bolt head to be rotated before the bolt was removed. There were other minor production economies that were also used to make the barrel and furniture. Interestingly, the production of Mark I Star No. 4s was confined to North America, both in Canada at Long Branch and in the United States. In this pattern, the primary method of rifling was the 2-groove, with 5 and 6-groove patterns in the minority. There were other versions made during the war that deserve mention. Famously, Holland & Holland stocked up select No. 4s for use in the sniping role, and thus rendered the No. 4 T. This was used post-war as well. There were post-war versions of the No. 4, namely the Mark II and the Mark 1/2 and 1/3. Generally speaking, these rifles returned to a more peacetime style of manufacture, with better quality components. Perhaps the salient feature of these was the relocation of the trigger to the body versus the trigger guard, which alleviated some of the issues had with the trigger pressure found in the Mark I and Mark I Star. Other, more minor members of the family included the No. 5 and the No. 7 and the No. 9. The former being a cut-down version of the No. 4 to lighten its weight, and the No. 7 and 9 were .22 training rifles. All of these are outside the scope of this video. The bayonet. The bayonet issued with the No. 4 was a departure from patterns used since the 1890s. It was decided that a simple spike would be able to perform all the necessary functions without great length or weight. During the war, there were 4 versions produced. The No. 4 Mark I having the cruciform blade. The Mark II and Mark II Star had round cross-section blades and were of one-piece cast design. Perhaps the version that represented wartime economy more than anything else was the Mark III, with the blade fixed to a rough cast hilt with what was at times a very unsightly weld. It's interesting to note, however, that none of this had any effect on its performance. Sights. A large number of back sights were issued with the No. 4. Now, this is not intended to be an exhaustive look at the subject, itself a topic for another video, but some background bears mention. Originally issued with the Mark I back sight, this sight provided a small, adjustable aperture for use at ranges from 200 to 1300 yards, and a fixed battle sight for use at closer ranges when the latter was folded down. It was a relatively complicated and precision piece of kit, and these proved to be in short supply during wartime economy. A stopgap was therefore required. The Mark II sight was a simple 2-leaf flip-type aperture graded from 300 yards with the bayonet fixed to 600 yards without. While being generally serviceable, the Mark II sight was not perhaps ideal. Work was set about to produce a sight that would be nearly as comprehensive as the Mark I, while being simpler and easier to manufacture. 2 patterns were produced, the Mark III and the Mark IV, the latter improving on the former's spring arrangement and serviceability. They were both made from stampings, versus the fine machining in the Mark I. There were also different sizes of apertures used in the manufacture of the sights, mainly in regards to the battle sight. This aspect is perhaps beyond the subject of this video, but I'm pretty sure that bloke on the range, who kindly provided these photographs, is working on something to that end. My No. 4 is a Mark I Star, and was made at Long Branch in 1944. It exhibits all the usual characteristics of that version, and includes a Mark II bayonet. Perhaps typical of Mark I Star No. 4s, it has 2-grooved rifling, and so far seems to shoot my cast loads with reasonable accuracy. It has all the usual dings, blemishes, and otherwise character-building marks that you'd find on a typical service rifle. Note the fluted handguard. It has the Mark I sight, adjustable by clicks from 200 to 1300 yards. The muzzle end of the barrel has the usual arrangement of foresight, protectors, and the lugs for the associated bayonet. We can see here the battle sight, made usable when the sight is folded down. Its aperture is considerably larger, and the one that is used when the sight is flipped up is smaller for better accuracy. These views show with clarity both the integral charger bridge as well as the cut in the ribway to allow for the removal of the bolt. All in all, my rifle is perhaps suitably Canadian and represents the service rifle as used by Canada in the vast majority of the actions fought during the Second World War. Ammunition. Service ammunition for the number 4 was the ubiquitous Mark VII, with its bimetal core of lead antimony and aluminum with a cupro-nickel or later copper jacket. These were fitted in chargers of 5 rounds, which, for active service, were packaged in bandoliers of 50 rounds, as they had been since before the Great War. Not perhaps the subject of this video, but mention should be made about the equipment and how rifle ammunition was carried. The 1937 Webb equipment was for frontline troops, not provided with individual pouches for chargers, as had the preceding 1908 set. The adoption of the Bren gun, combined with other bulky ammunition types for the boys' anti-tank rifle and the 2-inch mortar, saw that the neat and very serviceable cartridge carriers of the 1908 set were necessarily replaced with 2 large basic pouches, which could accommodate the many natures of ammunition thus mentioned. Typically, a rifleman would then carry the following: 2 Bren gun magazines, 2 grenades, and a bandolier of 50 rounds for his rifle. This could be augmented by yet another bandolier. They were ubiquitous, as these pictures have shown. Thus, this lightweight and disposable implement was the primary way in which ammunition was carried for the rifleman. Simply slung over the left shoulder, this arrangement does not seem to be wholly serviceable at the outset, but remembering that the bandolier was a disposable item, its serviceability was rarely in doubt. Now, did some men carry loose chargers in their basic pouches? Perhaps. The ammunition that I use for my number 4 is the typical 303 loading that I use for both the Lee-Metford and the SMLE. A 210 grain bullet cast of linotype atop 24 grains of 4.227. This makes for fun, economical shooting with mild recoil. The velocity is in the neighborhood of 1800 feet per second. Loading and firing of the number 4 was as simple and as basic as with the earlier patterns of charger loading Lee-Enfield rifles. First, the safety catch was pushed forward and the bolt was opened. A charger of 5 rounds was removed from the bandolier and placed in the charger bridge. With the thumb of the right hand, the rounds were pushed evenly into the magazine. The bolt was closed, which could also move the empty charger out of the way, and the safety catch was applied by pulling it to the rear. Although shown here loading but 5 rounds, in action the magazine would have been charged with 10. To fire, the sights were set to the appropriate range, or indeed the fixed battle sight was used. Aim was taken, and the trigger pressed. As far as shooting and musketry in general are concerned, the strength of the number 4 lies in its sights. With the battle sight, it is very good at up-close work, and with the sight raised, precision can be attained with the smaller aperture and adjustable settings. The number 4 was an eminently serviceable rifle, with a reliable, smooth action, good sights, and a moderate weight. It was capable of being used in close quarters and at range, and was very much of the same pedigree as its older cousins. It maintained its 10-round magazine, which set it apart from rifles used by other nations. This provided a useful reserve. It was easily carried in all types of terrain and was robust enough to suffer through all the climates it was used in. Truly a weapon for its age. It is perhaps a paradox that the improvements made to render the number 4 came at a time when warfare had long ceased to be ultimately determined by the man and his rifle. This had last been the case in 1914. By the coming of the Second World War, the panoply of weapons at the disposal of the infantry in particular would render the rifle to become somewhat secondary. It nevertheless formed part of that same panoply, and without it, the infantry could not have done their job. Warfare of the 1940s was an evolutionary process. Mechanization, rapid movement, and the sheer volume of war material brought to the battlefield would seem to have made the rifleman redundant. He was not. The infantry rifleman was as important as he had ever been, for despite the firepower and capabilities of the contemporary army, those last 50 or 100 yards could only be crossed by the infantry and what they could carry. The number 4 formed the foundation of that. Now that this, the introduction to the number 4, has been completed, other subjects relating to its use can be covered, including mid to late war musketry, tactical employment, and associated equipment. At the time of the production of this video, some interesting projects have already taken shape and will feature in upcoming installments in the series. I'd like to thank Mike from Bloke on the Range. Firstly, he kindly provided the pictures of the various patterns of sight used with a number 4. In addition, at the time of the production of this video, he's only recently completed a visit to my part of the world. This was the fruition of what you might call a little bit of mutual coaxing. Mike coaxed me into examining the number 4 rifle. Its era is somewhat beyond what the channel typically deals with, and by his own admission, I was able to coax him into participating in, shall we say, a little bit of historical shooting. For to truly gain the experience in using these military weapons, one has to also use the equipment associated with them. The uniforms, well, that's just a little bit of atmosphere. All in all, a fantastic time, and I hope you'll enjoy the fruits of our labors as the number 4 series progresses. And last but not least, to a friend of the channel, Vince, who kindly lent me his number 4 Mark I for the production of this video. Thanks, V.